thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. So today, by the end of this webinar, you'll be able to know more about, open source alternatives, why specifically PostgreSQL, and know most importantly about how we do those migrations automatically from Oracle database to PostgreSQL by leveraging automation. Oh, excellent. I see Michel was able to make it. Great.
Great. Yeah.
Good. We're all here. Perfect. So quickly, in terms of agenda, so we're going to do introductions about our team, a bit of information about Renaps and our partner Splendid Data. We're going to be also talking about open source, why we believe it's the future, or at least a big part of it. Now, in the open source database, why specifically PostgreSQL? And we're going to go into those details a bit. WhyCortex, what is it? How does it work? Why is it really a game changer in migrating Oracle database, to that alternative, to PostgreSQL? We're going to do a demo of the migration assessment today. So today is the first webinar of a series. Today's subject, we're going to address, the assessment part and talk about the theory around PostgreSQL and Cortex. And we'll be happy to do, more webinars. We're also happy to answer any questions through the chat. So if anyone has any question, please feel free to write down any question you might have in the chat box, and we will address all of them towards the end of the webinar. And we're also going to be looking into a few specific examples. When migrating from Oracle to PostgreSQL, some areas are a bit more complex than others. We want to tackle a bit some of those complexities. And we'll talk about post-migration services using Renaps Center of Excellence. So at the end, after this webinar, we will be sending a questionnaire to everyone who's attending, and we'll be picking 2 random responders for a $100 Amazon gift card. And this is just simply for taking the time to be with us today and to answer the questions at the end of the webinar. So a bit of a presentation. Myself, Patrick Emu. I'm CEO of Renaps. I'm an Oracle DBA in terms of background, so I have some good, I would say, knowledge about the Oracle database specifically, and technologies around open source in general. So I'll be happy to talk about those subjects today.
My name is Michel Schupkens, the COO of Splendid Data, and also one of the founders, and working in IT and studied IT in the beginning of the 80s already. So I always say my first Oracle training in 84.
Thanks, Michel.
My name is Mark Angenen. I'm the CTO of Splendid Data and also delivery management responsible. Extensive background in Oracle, also since the 90s, and since the last 7 years also in Postgres.
All right, thank you. So in terms of our partnership, if we talk about Renaps and Splendid Data, Splendid Data has the technology is behind WhyCortex. They are who built that technology and the tool. Renaps has a center of excellence and migration experience with diverse migration, whether we're talking about applicative forms, reports, or some other databases. In terms of what we do, we accompany our customers and we help those migration projects. Splendid has developed the technology and has a lot of experience, and together the combination have built the WhyCortex tool. So quickly about Renaps, founded in 2001, a company that follows ISO 9001 standards for over 12 years now. We're an Oracle partner, been doing a lot of Oracle projects, whether we're talking about migrations, upgrades, lots of projects completed. And Renaps is a company with about 60 experts and consultants besides the people in the administrative side. We have a certain number of technology partnerships. You see a lot of red in here. but we also do a lot of other stuff, including PostgreSQL, MySQL, and other database. I'll let Michel talk a bit more about Splendid.
Yeah, thank you, Patrick. Yeah, the company is established in 2013 in the summer. Good to know that all of our people have extensive knowledge of both Oracle and PostgreSQL. We have an indirect market approach via partners, global, regional, and also local partners. And one of those partners is, of course, Renaps. We have developed Cortex. It's our product for assessing and migrating Oracle databases to PostgreSQL. It's a licensed software and it's used by partners like Renaps, but also end user organization to perform assessments and migrations themselves. Next to that, we have developed PostgreSQL. We have combined the community version of Postgres with other open source tools, for instance, for high availability and backup recovery and so, to make the complete enterprise environment. It's a subscription-based license, as you can call it, and that subscription delivers 7x24 SLA-based technical support, and we do the release management over all the components so that you always are provided with a stable release with the latest versions of those components where applicable.
Excellent. Thank you, Michel. And we'll be happy to provide any information you would need about any of those products, including PostgreSQL or Cortex, should you have interest or need more information about any of them. So Ormit Suite, well, some of us already know Renaps in terms of what we do surrounding Oracle Forms to Java, Oracle Reports to Jasper, and all those open source migration alternatives. What we bring is basically the combination of both technology and experience through partnerships, and to be to enable basically our customers to open their options, to be more free and capable to move towards open source alternatives when needed. In terms of the suite of Ormit, many of you already know the Ormit Java, for which we've done several webinars. Ormit Java is as part of the tools set is the one that migrated Oracle Forms application to Java. But once those applications are migrated, those databases become very good targets to be migrated to PostgreSQL, and to basically complete that circle of moving to open source, if that's what customers would like to achieve. So this migration suite covers several aspects, and Cortex is basically what we are talking about really today. About Ormit in general, what we do is that we automate as much as possible, whether you want to migrate or upgrade, depending on the type of project. The essence of Ormit stands for Oracle Migration Tool, Ormit. And the essence of Ormit is to cut the cost and the time by up to 90%, sometimes more depending on the project, to follow best practices, make sure we never introduce any proprietary code or anything that would make you even more in terms of a lock-in, and at the end of the day, reduce your Oracle footprint. So let's talk about open source. We think that it's a big part of the future. We know that many customers are already leveraging a lot of open source, whether it's through some database systems or from development languages. What are the strategic reasons why many customers are looking into those? Well, one of them is to reduce the footprint, the software footprint, the proprietary software footprint. As you all know, Oracle comes at a certain price and with a certain also level of unpredictable audits and high costs. Those are aspects that we see why customers are tending to move towards alternatives. We see this definitely as a big wave. It doesn't seem to be slowing down. It's something that keeps picking up more and more. The more companies are comfortable with open source, the more they are looking to that alternative. Reducing expensive maintenance and support services is definitely one of the areas why customers want to do this. Sometimes it's because we want to move towards a major cloud platform and not be completely tied to Oracle specifically. And you might want to be moving to Azure, to AWS, to any cloud, whether you want to have a hybrid deployment or a complete cloud deployment. Well, those alternatives are going to make sense as soon as you move towards PostgreSQL as an example. And in terms of technology, well, we see more and more that open source is picking up very quickly towards what Oracle has been doing in terms of performance, scalability, security, support, and many other factors. So that's why it now makes more and more sense for companies to take that as a consideration. If we talk about open source, there are many choices out there. And so why specifically PostgreSQL? There are many reasons for that. And maybe I'll take my my DBA hat and I'll try to dig a bit with you guys in terms of why PostgreSQL we think is definitely the right way to go. First of all, if we look at a database, what is easy to migrate and what is complicated to migrate? The easy part is the data. Typically, in terms of data, whether you have a million tables or 5 tables, the database itself, the data is not what is the most complex part of any of this type of migration. Of course, there are some special data types sometimes, but where the complexity lies more is also into the PL SQL and the code that you have in your Oracle databases. In terms of procedural language and extensibility, by default, PostgreSQL is an excellent candidate. Why? Because instead of the PL SQL, you now have the PL PGSQL, which provides great extensibility within the database platform. And this way, all your stored functions, your stored procedures, your language, your business logic is going to be maintained. It's just simply converted from one language to another, but you will maintain all of this. But if we dig a bit into why PostgreSQL specifically, well, in terms of data types, as an example, all the primitive, let's say, data types such as integer, numeric, string, Boolean, of course, all of that is there. Structured data types such as date, time, array, range, also. You can even have JSON document data types, or XML, key value, HStore. It goes far, even in terms of geometry or customizations. Custom data types are even possible with PostgreSQL. In terms of data integrity, what we see is that Oracle is even more less restrictive than PostgreSQL. So you can maintain extremely well your data integrity with unique key, not nulls, primary keys, foreign keys. All of those type of integrity is also very well maintained. For performance or concurrency, all the B-tree indexes, the multi-columns, all this is maintained. There is a very large number of functionalities surrounding performance, including parallelization, which is not an extra fee to be paying in anyhow. Partitioning is also a good thing that is still there in PostgreSQL, by the way. There are many things, including disaster recovery, point-in-time recovery. If we talk about the way to recover a database, security is at the highest level with authentication that could be relying on an LDAP, but also with high encryption, 256-bit with certificate and many other robust access control systems that are part of PostgreSQL. We talked a bit about extensibility, which is an important factor. Make sure that your PL/SQL code and your whole application will be able to be maintained going forward. But what's a great thing about PostgreSQL is you're not specifically just limited to PL, PG, SQL. You can also incorporate Perl, Python, and many more languages into your database. And then internationalization, character sets and all these things, same thing. You will keep all these functionalities in PostgreSQL as well. If we compare a bit some features in terms of, high-level enterprise edition features that we see in Oracle, you have, in Oracle, many features that are there. Most of these are still there in PostgreSQL. The only difference, you are not basically paying anything in terms of licensing. In terms of optional features that you see in Oracle, such as active data guard, multi-tenant, partitioning, all that is there in PostgreSQL, but with no additional licensing either. Upgrade support fees. You have two options with PostgreSQL. You can decide to be simply supported by a very large and active community of PostgreSQL, which by itself is already very good. Or you can decide to take a professional subscription-based support, the same kind as what Michel was talking about, Postgres Pure, which will provide enterprise-level professional support services. In terms of support quality, we've all suffered a bit going through Oracle support, and we know what it means. Sometimes having to escalate a ticket many times and trying to get the right support, the right people to answer the right questions, is not always easy. PostgreSQL, you would get a very reactive and agile SLA-based support. And for cloud, with Oracle, you're very much restricted to bring your own license, or restricted by specifically using the Oracle Cloud for some particular platforms, such as an example, Autonomous Database. PostgreSQL, well, it just means freedom. So let's jump quickly, I don't want to take too much time, into WhyCortex. Cortex, what is it? It's a software product that's going to help to assess and migrate both the database object, the data object, as well as the code object of any Oracle database to native PostgreSQL. If we look into why Cortex is a proven technology, first, almost any Oracle database can be migrated as long as there is no IP infringements. We know some databases, as an example, that are tied to a product, tied to a specific product. These are typically not the best candidates. Another thing, well, what you get with WhyCortex is definitely the most advanced Oracle to PostgreSQL assessment and migration product, and we'll show you why today. It will take care of all dependencies between objects, and on average, you get 80% of the code objects, and in most cases, 100% of the data objects can be automatically migrated, translated into PostgreSQL. A very important point is that this is a native PostgreSQL translation. There is no proprietary or any compatibility layer or no vendor lock-in. What you get at the end of this migration is a database that is purely PostgreSQL, and for which you can deploy on any open source standard PostgreSQL without any additional layer or lock-in. The approach is repeatable, it's consistent, it's kind of a factory approach that you can migrate one database or 1,000 database, doesn't make any difference. You'll be 100% free to deploy on any cloud, whether on-premise, on community version of the PostgreSQL. The size of the database does not matter, and it will take into account any Oracle 10G and up, and also PostgreSQL 10 and up. So maybe I'll leave it to Michel. Oops. So here we go. Maybe to compare a bit.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's always hard to compare yourself with other possibilities, but I will say each possibility has its own advantages and disadvantages. And at the end, it's up to the client to decide what suits best to them. If you look at the metrics, most of the option provide what we call an assessment step. So to inspect, before you start a migration, to inspect your complexity of an Oracle database to be migrated to PostgreSQL. If you look at Cortex, because that's the only one with yes, if we perform an assessment, we actually perform a migration to get the most accurate results. So what you see is what you get at the end. The migration of the data object is in general what you see a no-brainer, and that's what we perceive every migration or every assessment we do. The data object won't be the problem. It will get exciting when code objects, especially PL/SQL, have to be migrated to native PostgreSQL. It's not strength if you look, for instance, to Aura to PG, but Aura to PG is a free tool. It's open source, so it maybe can help you with your specific case or an amount of specific cases, but that's up to you to decide and to find out. If you look, for instance, at EDB, Enterprise DB, they heavily rely on emulation and partly translation, but good to know it's proprietary software and it leaves a footprint behind. And that means that there's vendor lock-in involved. But again, it does its work. It's a good product, but it's your choice if you want to switch from one vendor lock-in to another vendor lock-in. If you look at AWS, yeah, it's working well, but yeah, sometimes it's less accurate. And if we look at Cortex, it's accurate. We do context-related semantic translation, so it's more the parser compiler approach we do. What's very important, we take all dependencies between code objects, but also between data objects and code objects into account. And yeah, we continuously improve the software based on cases we do, but also what our partners are doing. So we get all that info and we see, okay, how can we improve that? We can raise the percentage automatically migrated every time. Patrick?
Thank you, Michel. Excellent. Yes, and it's a great point. You know, the fact that EDB, you know, locks you in with emulation and with functionality that basically going from one vendor locking to another is definitely something I would think that, you know, is important to try to avoid. In terms of business value, if we talk about Cortex, one important aspect, no redesign, you know, minimal migration risk. Why? Because it's a highly automated migration. We mentioned already both DDL and DML objects will remain identical to Oracle, meaning that you can maintain all this business logic. Minimal learning curve. Why? Well, because all of the coding structures that you currently had in PL/SQL will be maintained in PL/PGSQL, which makes it much easier for developer learning curve. By the way, even comments in the code, if you have comments in the previous version in the Oracle database, you will find those same comments brought over to the PL/PGSQL code as well. And cost and time reduction is definitely what is the big value of WhyCortex. By repeatable and consistent approach, we greatly reduce the time to migrate from one to another. All right, maybe Mark, let's talk a bit about the migration approach.
Yes, let's do that. First, looking to some common migration complexities and challenges we see when we do migrations. We have carried out a lot over the years, and we can identify some common complexities about that. I call it challenges instead of problems because they're always solvable, and if not, we find a way to go. In the area of the data objects, the DDL, these challenges are differences in data types, which are never a blocking issue. And the most obvious one is the difference in data and time-related data types, which are not the same as in Oracle. Functionally, it's a bit all the way around. We see also errors in the area of foreign key mismatches because this is Oracle is less strict about this than Postgres is. And when we look at the use of partitioning in Oracle, this is mostly in 9 out of 10 cases for performance reasons. And while in Postgres, it is not necessary for performance reasons. So we always look at the intent usage of partitioning. If it really has a functional reason, we take also the implementation of partitions into account from the start. But if not, we decide if we need it during testing of performance. Special attention is paid to the use of geometric data types used in Oracle. Out of the box, Postgres supports 6 data types that represents 2-dimensional geometric objects. And when it comes to real GIS applications, Postgres uses the PostGIS extender, which offers many features, even beyond the ones in Oracle Spatial. So GIS is not a problem at all, but it does deserve some attention. If you look in the area of the code objects, the DML, that's where the real challenges for migrations arise and where we say even the fun starts. The most prominent one of these are the use of the so-called Oracle built-in packages, most of which we can handle in Postgres, but there are some such as advanced queuing and job scheduling with job chains that are not supported within the Postgres database. This has to be solved outside Postgres, and any code in the database has to be adapted manually. There are several open source alternatives available, like RabbitMQ, and for these challenges and choices should be made before any migration would start. And also built-ins with regard to file transfer and mailing must be solved outside the database. There's also, if you have embedded languages, that's not a problem, like C or Java in the database, it also deserves some separate attention. And special attention needs to be paid to transaction management, because every executable SQL in Oracle is a start of a transaction and ends with a commit or a rollback in Oracle. But in Postgres, a transaction only starts with a begin and it ends with an end. So that is something to be aware of. And yeah, Oracle is, so to say, more an environment, and Postgres is a pure database, being able to do where a database is meant for. Safe and reliable storing your most valuable asset, and that's your data. Well, let's go to the next slide, please. This is a picture of our overall approach when we talk about migrations, and it is represented in this overview. Above the dotted line, you see our migration scoping service. This is not covered during this webinar, but maybe content for a follow-up. I will briefly explain what we do with this service because it's not a licensed product. In essence, it's categorizing all of your Oracle databases, and that can be one to many, and divide them into 4 buckets of complexity, from very simple to complex. If your databases are divided into these 4 buckets, you will have valuable information and input for an overall migration planning approach. And I give you a free advice: do not start with the complex ones, but with the very simple ones, because this will kick off your migration projects and you get familiar with how it works, and your teams can get used to what to do in order to take a migrated database into production before starting to work on the complex ones. And for the buckets 1 and 2, we can give you directly after the scoping the time needed per database to be migrated. And for the databases in the categories 3 and 4, we need to do an in-depth assessment to be able to give a fixed quotation or a time estimate. These migration assessments will be done by using our migration software product Cortex, which will be presented later on, So before we dive deeper into Cortex, it's good to know that upfront that every assessment we perform is actually already a migration. And that's why we can give a fixed quote after every assessment. In rare cases, there might be a no-go, but if we look back, we had only once an Oracle 8 database with an old-fashioned character-based front end. And in that specific case, we advised to rebuild this application based on more modern techniques and tools. And now we will dive a little bit deeper into Cortex and what it is capable of. So before I will start a recorded demo of an assessment with Cortex, I will briefly explain how it works. First of all, we need to download the Cortex image and tools to create a starter container, because Cortex is based on a container product. When the container is running, we can actually begin with an assessment. And this will start off with loading the extracted catalog views of the to-be migrated Oracle database. And there are two ways of doing this, via an Oracle foreign data wrapper connection to the Oracle database, or by loading CSV files of the catalog views of the Oracle database. For this extraction of the catalog views, you will get a dump script which extracts the catalog views we need for an assessment migration. So we need no data at all at this time, because that's only needed when everything is migrated. The CSV method is preferred because it's the simplest and easiest one to carry out. The loading of the catalog views will be done directly in a Postgres database, the so-called pre-migration database. And then the process of the data object migration will start and will deliver reports with the results of this process. After the DDL migration has ended, the code migration DML will start in conjunction with the code checker, which validates if the produced code by the migration process will be correct PL/PG/SQL instead of the Oracle PL/SQL code. After this process has ended, reports will be produced with the results of this DML process as well. All these reports as outcome of this assessment will give an accurate insight about this migration assessment. And for a real migration, this process works exactly the same. The only difference is that we'll show and explain you on the next slide. And before we will look into this, I need to make clear once more that doing an assessment with Cortex is actually a migration. And that's why we can predict and define so precise what the outcome of a migration will be. So on the next slide, we see the migration process. And as you see, the picture representing the process of a migration is almost the same as the process of performing an assessment. And the main difference is that an assessment runs from the start to finish, and the migration can be done step by step to be able to influence the outcome based on the assessment results you get previously. For example, solving a foreign key issue or other DDL issues based on the assessment results might be changed already on the source database Oracle. Let's give an example for that. If we see invalid or disabled objects, which we were indicated during the assessment, you can solve them already on your Oracle part, so they will be done during migration as well. Another extra in the use of is the code formatter, which influence the mockup of your code based on predefined profiles or your organization-based profile, which you can make yourselves. By this, all of your migrated code will look the same after migration, which will be a huge benefit for maintaining your code base after the migration. Another important extra outcome of the migration is the filling of a Git repo by the migration thinker. This Git repo will contain every piece of migrated object, which will be the source for the manual change process of code, so it is not automatically migrated, and also contains the version history during your migration project. There will be also a file with all the issues to be solved to populate a Jira, for example. And this Jira issues population is actually the workload to be performed on your migrated code base in Git. And I think you will understand that these outcomes give you all the ingredients to master your migration projects identically over time, from which you will benefit enormously by the use of Cortex. It's the same process over and over again, database per database. So let's go to the demo now, the recorded demo. I will take over the presentation for that.
Yes.
You see my screen now?
Yep.
Patrick,
Yes.
yes?
Yes.
Okay. Good. I will start a video of the demo assessment that we conducted for this webinar. It's a video because otherwise we are sitting around waiting too long for the whole process to be done. So this video will be played at a faster speed, and I will explain here and there what we are seeing. It starts with downloading the Podman image and checking if the checksum is okay, and then we do a create container called mark test, and then a Podman load image, and then we also see that on my file system a mounted directory is created. The container was successfully created. We need to write down the port number of the web front end and the database in the container, because we will need those port numbers later on. In the mounted directory, we see that the place where the Oracle catalog views need to be landed will be empty at this moment. And I use a file manager to put the CSV files, which are the result of the extract dump file from the catalog, Oracle catalog views. I will transfer them to the right place, and I will open the table CSVs to show that the tables will end up in the Postgres database. You see that they are transferred to the mounted CSV in directory. And this is the tables column where you see all the schemas and the tables which need to be transferred. Now we open a browser to start the web front end, which we are going to use to start the assessment. We use the local host with the port number which we got previously, which I noted down when the container was created. So that port number gives access to the front end. I start pgadmin directly and use the other port number to connect to my database. We see two databases, the Postgres database, the Postgres database needed for the assessment, and my mark test database for the migration assessment objects. We see 20 schemas that are standard and needed for the migration and the assessment. Now we go back to the web front end to start the migration assessment. There are a number of choices to make how to handle various variables regarding the migration. And for example, you can determine how to handle APIs, whether to migrate arrays or domains, how raw is converted, how unspecified numbers are migrated, how procedures and functions and transactions are dealt with, and how the package initialization will be done. Also, the beautifier profile can be set, but that for an assessment, that's not necessary. That's only necessary for a migration. So we now start the assessment process, and that starts with the data objects. So the DDL part with the loading of the metadata, all the CSV files, and then the generation of the tables and indexes, sequences, and keys, and then the code object starts to migrate. That's running. We can look at the data objects that are now in the database already because the DDL part is already done. I do a refresh, and you can see that there are now, instead of 20, 50 table and 50 schemas available. If you go back to the, you see that in schema 2, you now see all the tables already there. We now get back to the front end again, and the code objects are still running, but the reports are already there for from the DDL migration. So you see that they produced 5 reports, and we will look into report 1 and report 4. We start report 1, and there you see that there are a number of tabs underneath it, and we see that a number of objects we have found during the migration. You see the lines of code, the constraints, index, triggers, and we will go through them. You see that we have 2 invalid package bodies over here. And those 2 invalid package bodies represent 265 lines of code. We see how many constraints we have migrated. We see the indexes. There are no triggers in this one. We see the constraints per schema and so on. So really valuable information we see. Then we go to report 4. In this report, we see all the migration errors. In this case, there's only one. We see in the tabs beneath the postponed view translations, the foreign key mismatch, in this case, a description of this migration error. We see default errors, data type errors, object renames. When also we will go through these tabs. So now we see the postponed view translation, which will be done during the DML migration in this case. We see the foreign key mismatch. And we said all before that Oracle is less strict than Postgres. So in this case, we need to solve this foreign key mismatch. And either we make the reference data type also varchar, or other way around, we make a data type of the column filial git also to UUID. And if this is being done, this will be handy for the DML translation. Then we see all the default errors, and we see the data type errors which occur during the DML translation. Object renames we have done. If there were hidden columns, we see them also, this in this case, and we see also, and that's also important, some DB-linked reference mappings. We need the description of those DB-linked tables because when we have the descriptions during migration, we can benefit of that because then the DML will be done better. Now we go back to the front end again. And we see that the code objects are done, and another 2 reports will be produced. We will look into these reports as well, because in those reports we see what is done during the DML translation. We see all in the overall migration status. We see all per object what's okay or not okay with an eventual SQL status when it's not okay. We see also the load status during the migration, and that's more the things which are go wrong and why they are on the file system. And we see a count of the source lines per object. Report 7 is also interesting because this shows you how many percentage of this assessment is done automatically. And we see that more than 77% of this one was done automatically, and we have 22% which is not okay and which need to have manual actions involved. We see also the not okays per object type, and we see the SQL error status, and that gives us the ability to predict what needs to be done manually. And we can also, with this kind of information, calculate the time needed to do the manual actions. And it's represented in man-seconds, in this case divided by 3,600. We will end up with 20 man-hours to solve all the migration issues manually to have a 100% migrated database in the end. We have also some PostgreSQL errors per class and the SQL status code, which is also in this report. So this is the end of the video.
Thank you, Mark. And that's pretty amazing, to be able to complete, within 20 hours of manual work, the migration of a database. It's pretty awesome.
Absolutely.
So I know that we're a bit running out of time. We have about 10 minutes left. I think we should be okay. But what we wanted to show here is just a few examples of, the easy stuff is easy. Whatever the tool does automatically, we can consider that part of the easy stuff. We just want to show a few complexities and how we handle those specifically, how the tool handles those as well.
Yeah.
Here we go.
Okay. Yeah, you will be able to look back to the demo because we make it available. And to conclude this presentation and demo, I will show two examples of how Cortex handles the migration of PL SQL code to PL PostgreSQL. And the first example is the translation of an Oracle specific outer join with the plus symbol for the optional clause identifier in the query. This needs to be translated into NZ standard outer join syntax. In the case you like to maintain one code base for an Oracle and Postgres database, which often is interesting for an ISV, it's good to know that this NZ syntax can be used in Oracle as well. And the specific Oracle syntax cannot be used in Postgres, however, but that's clear. A lot of selects in an application contains this Oracle syntax as well and need to be translated too. So let's go to the next slide, please.
Basically, what you mean is that both this translated code will be able to be used in Oracle as well as in PL PostgreSQL because
yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And that can be interesting when you are an ISV, you want to maintain your code base for either Oracle and Postgres.
That's great. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So if we look to the outer join, the translation process in Cortex involves 5 steps, from identifying the required tables, listing the conditions involved, bridging, dangling outer joins with inner joins, grouping conditions in the where clause, and dropping the Oracle plus notation in the end. It then will look like from in the Oracle, and the translation by Cortex represented in the examples. And the next slide, please. This is an example which illustrates the translation by Cortex from an inner join in conjunction with an outer join. And on the next slide.
Here we go.
In this last example, we show one of the strong points of the use of Cortex. In this example, prior to this one, all the tables and columns were fully aliased, which is normally recommended, but it is not necessary. Obviously, it was not necessary in an Oracle database because of non-conflicting column names, but with the Cortex translation, because we already did the DDL translation, everything is already known upfront, because everything is stored in the repository of Cortex. So aliasing is not really needed by the use of Cortex. That makes things easier.
Perfect.
Now we go to a second and last example. And that's a nested function. As we all know, a nested function is a function or procedure defined with the declaration section of a PL SQL function procedure. There can be more than one nested function or procedure in a parent function or procedure, and the nested function shares variables scoped to the parent function. And the example illustrates a simple parent procedure called sp_fm with one nested function, find max. So you see the parent declaration on top, then the nested function, the begin of the parent, and the call of the nested function. And this is how it is represented in Oracle. Now we go to the next slide. The Cortex translation into PostgreSQL includes 6 steps, beginning with the isolation of the nested function, identifying the variables and variable access methods, rewriting the parent calls of the nested function, including the new parameters, and at last, if the nested function is a function, in contrast to a procedure, and the translation should be result in one or more additional out parameters to be shared with the parent, then the translator rewrite the function and its call as a procedure or use a session storage to pass the data between the two entities. And this will be shown in the next slide. This slide shows the translation of the earlier PostgreSQL example, and you can see the arrow pointings to the relevant translation made by Cortex. And you see it's a little bit around, but it works exactly like the old one. And then in the next and the last but not least slide, we see an example to show the accommodation of the parent variables in both directions. So this is the end of my part, and I pass over to Patrick again.
Thank you, Mark. That's very interesting.
No, thanks.
So,
show this.
Yes, that's very good. So maybe quickly about Renaps. What is it that makes Renaps great? I have to say, it's the center of excellence. It's our team, and it's what we do. We are proud, very proud of our team and the different expertise that we have in-house, covering Oracle, covering PostgreSQL, those migrations. In terms of migration team, I can say that we have the largest Oracle migration team available right now in North America, and be happy to help anyone that requires to maybe look into those possibilities, maybe do some scoping exercise or assessment if we wanted to go deeper, exactly like Mark and Michel showed us. Sorry. In terms of what we do in this center of excellence, well, we have a very strong database migration and upgrade team, which is backed by technology. Today we saw WhyCortex. We also have an application migration and upgrades, also backed by Ormit, helps automate as much as possible and reduce the scope, the time, the effort, and at the end of the day, the cost of those projects. And also all the other database maintenance, application maintenance, and other services surrounding technology. In terms of service models, within the Center of Excellence, the main thing, if we talk about Oracle to PostgreSQL migrations, it's definitely project-based. But we also have some very interesting models that could be looked into, such as the on-demand model and managed services model. The on-demand is basically making available all of our team that becomes a direct extension to your internal team, whether you need support for Oracle, need support for PostgreSQL, or any other technology that we have discussed. Be happy to do that. And managed services, we have 2 models with this, a hybrid or a full model, but it's basically a strategic partnership that's based on 4 pillars: specialized expertise, very flexible contracts, high security, and complete transparency. And this is also something we're very proud of and very happy to talk about. We've helped many customers, both in US, Canada, and we are located in Montreal mainly, but also have offices in New York. and let's open it up for questions. I think I saw a few questions.
Yes, there was
already.
a couple of questions. Would it also migrate XML type columns in Oracle as well?
Yes, that's no problem at all. There is yeah, I would say the same kind of XML support in Postgres as in Oracle. So that's no, yeah, that's no problem. It's covered during Cortex migration as well.
Perfect. There was another question as well. How do you deal with DB link between PostgreSQL and Oracle database both ways?
Both ways. Yeah, from Postgres to Oracle, we use a so-called Oracle Foreign Data Wrapper extension. And what you basically do is that you read from your Postgres database in your Oracle tables, and you can use all the data in your Oracle database. And we use that foreign data wrapper also to pick up what I said already during my presentations, the catalog views if you want to set up that Oracle foreign data wrapper, but you can use it as a DB link as well. And from the other way, from Oracle to Postgres, yeah, you can use your normal abilities of Oracle to use via ODBC and Oracle and another database. So you can connect via ODBC to the Postgres database.
Thank you. There is a question here about what is our view about data warehouse environments, which has been hosted currently in Oracle, plan to migrate to PostgreSQL. Is it ideal? That's the question. And I think there's a follow-up question while we're at it. My view is not to have a big warehouse environment in PostgreSQL. Sorry, it's moving. Here we go. Yeah, that's this question.
Sorry, what's the exact question, Patrick?
Yes, apologize. So what is our view on migrating a data warehouse environment currently on Oracle to PostgreSQL?
Yeah, we have done some data warehouse environments already, and yeah, we didn't have any issues with that, but it's a little bit depending on what kind of data warehouse tools are used in Oracle. Warehouse Builder and stuff like that. Yeah, taking the model into account is not an issue. So.
All right, thank you. So it maybe requires maybe a bit of an analysis to.
Yeah, analysis, but but the assessment will also give you some clues about that.
Okay, perfect. What's the advantage of Postgres Pure on top of EDB PostgreSQL? Maybe this one's for Michel or Mark.
I think that's something Michel can.
Both are subscription-based products, and yeah, Postgres Pure is 100% open source. And if you look at EDB, and again, I have nothing against EDB, they have good tools, but be aware it's proprietary software. So, and that's, if you look at subscribing software, if you compare it to Oracle, you have a perpetual license. So if you stop your maintenance, you're still able to run your software on the version you have, only you have no maintenance. If you stop your subscription from Postgres for an EDB, you have to delete your software. So that means you have nothing. And even if you use their compatibility layer or specific functions, those are proprietary within their version of Postgres because it's a fork. Yeah, you get stuck because you have no other platform to go to because it won't run on the open source. And we already migrated some clients in the Netherlands who were using EDB back to open source, and from there on deploying on Postgres Pure, but they also have the freedom to deploy it on Postgres community version.
Thank you, Michel.
Again, it's not a bad product. It's nothing against EDB, but yeah, it's their way of how they do their business.
Mhm.
I heard one EDB guy once telling to me, yeah, we are a little bit open source. Yeah, I said, what's a little bit open source? It's the same as a little bit pregnant. It's all or nothing.
Good one, thank you.
Yeah.
There's also a question about handling dynamic DDL DML migration.
Yeah, yeah, I can give an example of these, how we handle it in Cortex as well. I showed you two examples of the outer join and the nested function, but we have a slide deck of 450 pages, which handles also the dynamic SQL. So yeah, I think we can cover a whole webinar about that, how we handle it and what can be done within Cortex with it.
All right, it's a big question then.
Yeah.
So there's one about hints, the use of hints. I know in Oracle, as an example, you can influence the optimizer and say, I want to use this particular index. How do you handle that in general around PostgreSQL?
Yeah, within Postgres, that's not, you cannot use that anymore. Of course, yeah, the optimizer in Postgres is totally different than the optimizer in Oracle, and I think that's not hard to understand. So
exact. Okay.
Yeah,
So
it has all to do with performance, and we always do a performance test at the end of our migration, and
yes,
yeah, you need to do it then on the Postgres way, and not on the Oracle way.
Good. There's an easy question. Can we share the slide deck? Absolutely. We will also share the video online with everyone.
I see also a question about from Michael Sawaski about the price of Cortex. He wants an estimate. I think the best way to go forward is to contact the guys from Renaps, and we will help you out with the answer.
Perfect, thank you. What about the code on the application side, not in the database? Is there automation migration? I think this really depends on what is your application based upon.
Yeah.
Is there, do you have maybe a language to share about your current application that you are thinking about? Based on that answer, we will, of course, give you an answer about that. It could be that your application does not need to be translated to anything and could now speak to the PostgreSQL database instead of talking to Oracle. But it really depends on what application exactly.
Yeah. And what middleware layers are used, Hibernate or something like that, ORM.
Correct, yes. Did we cover everything? Just want to make sure.
But Patrick,
yes,
on the application side, it's good to say that we have also a complete cookbook available. If you need to change embedded SQL code on your application side to PLPG SQL. So it's a how-to, how you can address those conflicts which are there.
Okay, perfect. Oh, there's a new question. Is it possible to migrate triggers and pipeline functions?
Yeah, absolutely. If you maybe can remember the reports I showed, the trigger one was empty, but we translate all the triggers we will come through. So that's not a problem, and the pipeline function as well. And that's also one other of those things in our 450 slide deck, how we cover pipeline functions.
All right, it's another big subject, but the short answer is yes.
Yeah.
Excellent. So if there is no more question, I just want to take the occasion to give a big thank you to everyone for your time, for being here today, and giving us the opportunity to share information about WhyCortex and this tool.